All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Ian asks, I was wondering if you could review a video on the origins of feminism. And the video he linked is called On the Genealogy of Feminism. And I will leave a link in the description. It's on Rumble because it's not the sort of thing that's allowed on YouTube. Which should give you a hint as to the sort of video we're talking about here. This video is a particularly propagandistic, and I don't mean that in a dismissive manner. I'm just talking about its tone. I'm talking about its mode. Just because something is using propagandistic techniques of repetition and visual imagery and so forth does not mean it's not true. But it's a mode to be aware of when you are watching things like documentaries and so forth. And it is positing something that is far more common on the internet and in right-wing circles especially than many people who are not online might believe. And that is the view that feminism essentially is just an expression of Judaism or perhaps of Jewishness. That it's all Jews. It's just feminism is because of Jews. This is not this is not an uncommon belief. I don't know if this is necessarily the strongest expression of the idea. You could probably find people like, I don't know if Kevin McDonald's ever said anything along those lines. You could look to the work of Greg Johnson, perhaps, and other people in that sphere for arguments in that domain. This feels like it's derivative or downstream from that. But we're going to take it seriously, and I'll explain why I think it's very important to take these kinds of arguments seriously at the end. So if this is offensive to you, do stick around. It's especially important for you. If this is not offensive to you and it's an important subject that you find yourself maybe believing, dear listener, then also stick around. We can have a bit of a conversation about this. So the presenter does say some. So one of the cues for the idea that they have a bit of an axe to grind is there's a few kind of throwaway facts that they assert that signal a bias and a sort of ideological interest here. For example, he says, with men, logic trumps emotion as opposed to women. And this is part of an explanation for why the Jews targeted women with their evil, nefarious propaganda, not men. Are men more logical than women? In one sense, I think so. I think men are more inclined to logic, in like scientific, nerdy ways. I think women are generally less interested in that. Does this make men more logical, more rational? No on two counts. First of all, logic and rationality is a really great way to manipulate people. People can be tricked with sound but not valid logic all the time. That's like half of what I've been doing the last year, but in different directions and with different bad premises that have to do with language. And men get tricked by logic a lot more often than women too. And second of all, men are not less emotional than women. Men are moved by different emotions than women. I think men experience love differently. There's all these memes of the guy who never cries but he sees something in a movie. If you ever find yourself reading Where Men Win Glory by, I can't remember the author's name, it's the Gates of Fire guy. It'll come to me when long later. But it's about Alexander the Great and his depiction of the speech that Alexander the Great gives to his mutineers who are to become his Silver Legion. I've heard that section of the book twice, and I cried both times. And women will never get that. Is that emotional manipulation? Why, yes, it is. Men do have these feelings, and men can be manipulated in that way too. We have a news story that's gone viral just this week of a young woman being stabbed in the neck by an urban man. Do you think that's riling up a lot of men across the country? Yes, it is. Is it because this is the first time someone's been stabbed in a city? No. It's because there's a video of it, and that video of a frankly, very pretty looking, young, helpless woman being stabbed in public like that makes men feel a certain kind of way. Men are very easy to manipulate with emotion, just as easily as women. And by the way, I'm not saying that men shouldn't be moved in that way. I'm just saying we are moved by our emotions in the same way that women are, although not by the same emotions. So that was one just kind of throwaway comment that is like, you're coming from a particular worldview. And sometimes that leads you to believe things that your worldview predicts without checking them. Another claim he made of that sort was he said that the majority of aborted babies are white. Now, I'm not even going to check that myself. So maybe I'm doing the same thing here, but I am fairly confident that is not the case, at least not per capita, at least not per population group. It skews wildly black, as I understand it, in the United States. And again, I'm not even checking that. I just think his assertion that the majority are white, if you were to measure against the population percentages of the country, I think that is probably not true. But anyways, those are digressions to prime you, which is its own sort of propaganda, I suppose. Be aware of it when I'm doing it too. That the person we're listening to here has an agenda, has a certain worldview they are trying to convey to you, and you should be aware of it. And they might be right, but you should be extra watchful for omissions and slips and bad connections here. Now again, this video is about the Jews. It's about Jews and Jewish influence in the United States, and it asserts that feminism is the result of Jewish influence. Is that true? What's interesting is he runs through a history of feminism with some key figures. And many of the figures he lists, there are a lot of Jews, by the way, in the history of feminism. It's a lot of Jews. But there were some interesting non-Jews that he listed as well, including Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Arthur Kinsey, who's not Jewish, and Margaret Sanger. And what is interesting is the author of this piece says, well, they were influenced by Jews. Well, okay, they might have been. But how I wonder, were the Jews that were so bad also influenced by non-Jews? Some of the Jews he lists as influences of these characters are people like Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud was highly influenced by Friedrich Nietzsche, who's German. He lists Karl Marx. Karl Marx was influenced by many people, including Adam Smith and the philosopher Feuerbach, who... Actually, I don't know that Feuerbach was not Jewish. He might have been. I believe he was German, though. He was a theologian. This influence connection goes both ways. And many of the Jews that these not just this author, but many of the people on the Everything's the Jews train treat it as a one-way direction of influence and not a two-way direction of influence. But what was also interesting, as someone who's done a little digging into the history of Jews, I'm sorry, the history of feminism, not the history of Jews, is the non-Jews that were not listed in our sort of list of our genealogy of feminism. This list of people not listed includes Mary Wollstonecraft, a very important name for anyone who doesn't know, probably the earliest feminist, and an English woman, English. He also does not list John Stuart Mill, who was a very public and prominent advocate for female suffrage and for women's rights and for feminism under that name back in the early 19th century. He does not list, at least I didn't catch him listing, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, also American and not Jewish. And I guess if we wanted to, we could also throw in Sojourner Truth and Frances E. Harper. And again, were some of these people influenced by Jews? Very possibly. Were the subsequent Jews who became the leaders of the feminist movement after these very prominent early figures influenced by these non-Jews? Absolutely, 100%. Yes, it was non-Jews influencing Jews. So what we see here is actually a kind of funny similarity between what feminists assert in patriarchy theory and what we need to find a name for this. What the anti-Jewish speakers and ideologues here, I won't call them ideologues, that's not fair, that's bad framing, believers, we'll say. We got to have a better name for that too. We call rulership by Jew. Jewarchy sounds too... Yeah, we'll go with it. Jewarchy. There's patriarchy and there's Jewarchy. The problem with patriarchy theory and feminism is that it gets the motivation and psychology of men completely wrong. Men are killing and oppressing each other more so than they are oppressing women. Women just don't see all the men that don't make it because they're looking at the higher class guys. That's not how, sexism is not the organizing principle of society. And Jewish oppression of the Goy is not the reason why Jews get into these movements. We'll get into that in a little bit. But there's a similarity in the way that the appearance of a disparity and outcomes you don't like leads to a theory of social control and organization surrounding a conspiracy of one group to oppress the others, between patriarchy theory and Jewarchy theory. So if we're going to be critical of feminism and say not just I don't like feminism, but feminism is wrong in its anthropology, we should be mindful of our own arguments against feminism when entertaining the Jewarchy hypothesis. But this runs into a big problem as far as what does it mean to be Jewish? Because Judaism is an interesting religion or group. Which is it? Is it both? Is it one or the other? Are secular Jews who are not religious Jewish? Is someone who converts to Judaism, like Ivanka Trump or someone, are they now essentially, do they have this Jewish character that we're talking about? What is the essence of Judaism here? Because if we look at the Orthodox Jewish community, it is hard to find a less feminist society. It is hard to find a society with more strict and, one might argue, oppressive gender roles. You'd have to go to Islam. I think, to find something more like structured in its gendered separation than Orthodox Judaism. So to say that feminism comes from Judaism or Jewishness or whatever it is we're talking about, something Jewy here, we have to unpack what it is we're talking about. And I think it's worth here taking moment. And it brought to mind a funny scene. I haven't seen this movie. I just saw a clip of it, and I had to do some research to find what the movie was from, where Ryan Gosling is playing the part of a Nazi, basically, in a diner. He's being interviewed by some journalist, and he says, the Jews are wanderers. They have no homeland. They have to come up with all these theories because a normal, healthy people derives their logic and their reason from the land, and Jews don't have that. And the journalist says, well, what about Israel? And he's like, those aren't real Scotsmen, or I'm sorry, those aren't real Jews. They're basically secular. They don't count because they have land, essentially. And I'll return to this movie, The Believer, a little bit later. So I do want to take a moment to talk a little bit about Judaism, because I think it's pertinent to this. I posted a reel a few weeks ago that got a lot of interest and commentary, some negative, a lot very positive, including from some Orthodox Jews in Israel, which was interesting, where I said that Judaism might be the worst religion in the world because it ties ethnicity to its religion in a way that creates a kind of social prison for its believers that they can't escape. There's an ethnic component that locks you in biologically, but there's also a social component that separates you. The whole idea of Judaism is we are a chosen people who've been chosen by God as special, as set apart. And there's a special role that the Jews will play in regard to the rest of creation. They're not better than other people. God has a plan for the rest of humanity too. But the Jews have a special part in that plan. They are to be set aside as a treasured with a special mission in relation to the unfolding of the love story between God and the world. And so there's a specialness. They're believed to be treasured by God, and there's a kind of superiority, I think, that comes from that. But this is coupled with a strange inferiority complex, because God chooses the weak to humble the strong. And this is a theme in the Bible. Moses had a speech impediment, but he's chosen to be the speaker for God, right? David going up against Goliath is this very small man. He's not a small man, but he's very small relative to Goliath. Small man that humbles the strong man, the large man. This is a persistent theme. And we can point to exceptions, people like Samson, for example. But there are, two examples for every counterexample. You also have, Jacob and Esau. Jacob is the smaller, weaker one, but he gets the inheritance, not Esau. So that must be a very strange experience for Jews to be told and taught that they are special and in some sense above everyone else. But at the same time, they have been elevated precisely because they are weaker and inferior. And the history of their people has been basically a nonstop history of infidelity to God. You're wandering in the desert for a few years, you worship a bull. God walks away for 10 seconds and you're already abandoning him. But like an ever faithful husband, he keeps coming back to his unfaithful bride, the Jewish people. That's the metaphorical language that gets used in the Old Testament. So, what a strange psychological profile this must develop culturally. And the setup where you are to be set apart, but also a diaspora without a homeland until the Messiah comes, with a special mission in relation to the other people of the world. It's not totally clear what the nature of that mission is, but you have a special part to play. You are to be a diaspora population, but also retain your otherness, to retain your separation, with a bit of a superiority complex and a bit of a paranoid inferiority complex, is the perfect setup for an anxiety paranoia complex that is going to cause other people to resent you or even hate you. But you can't escape this because you've been marked as a Jew, and the Jewish community is always there waiting for you, and setting an example of what you will be like for these other people. And to top that all off, the tension and conflict between non-Jewish host populations and the Jewish diaspora that lives in that place are predicted by prophecies. So any conflict that emerges is reinforcement of that prophecy and reinforcement of the identity, plus the oppression and trauma of those conflicts creates a trauma bond among Jews as Jews, which is what the Holocaust is today. It's nothing other than a trauma bond for Jews. So, is it any wonder that we see one of the strangest, but at the same time most predictable phenomenons of our time, which is Jewish anti-Semitism, Jewish anti-Jewishness? One of the figures that the author of this video piece keeps bringing up, and this may sound like a huge digression from feminism, but I think it matters a lot. He lists Karl Marx as an example, and Marx is very influential in Jewish thought, by the way. But one thing that you could describe Marx as is an anti-Semite. Was he Jewish? Yes. Was he anti-Semitic? Also, yes. I'm going to read a little bit at length of Karl Marx's On the Jewish Question from 1843. Quote, "Let us consider the actual worldly Jew, not the Sabbath Jew, as Bauer does," this was in response to a piece by Bauer, "but the everyday Jew. Let us not look for the secret of the Jew in his religion. Let us look for the secret of his religion in the real Jew. What is the secular basis of Judaism? Practical need, self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly god? Money. Very well then, emancipation from huckstering and money, consequently from practical real Judaism, would be the self-emancipation of our time. An organization of society which would abolish the preconditions for huckstering and therefore the possibility of huckstering would make the Jew impossible. His religious consciousness would be dissipated like a thin haze in the real vital air of society. On the other hand, if the Jew recognizes that this practical nature of his is futile and works to abolish it, he extricates himself from his previous development and works for human emancipation as such, and turns against the supreme practical expression of human self-estrangement. We recognize in Judaism, therefore, a general antisocial element of the present time, an element which, through historical development, to which, in this harmful respect, the Jews have zealously contributed, has been brought to its present high level, at which it must necessarily begin to disintegrate. In the final analysis, the emancipation of the Jews is the emancipation of mankind from Judaism." End quote. That's Karl Marx. I'm going to list a few other characters here that illustrate the point very well, I think. First off, while we're talking about Marx and Marxism, why don't I mention Matt Christman and Felix Biederman, the two of the hosts of the fairly well-known Chapo Trap House podcast, which I listen to from time to time, actually. They're funny, and they're good. I don't agree with them on hardly anything. But they're was strangely insightful. And they're both Jewish, by the way. They're not the only hosts of the show, and some of the other hosts are not Jewish. But they, in one of their videos, where they were making fun of some Jewish conservative commentator, I think, one of them described Orthodox Judaism as, I'm quoting this from memory because it was striking at the time. They called it the most insane religion in the world. That's from two Jewish Marxists. Very, very anti-Judaism. I want to mention Eric Clopper, who is, I believe he's a libertarian, but he's most primarily an anti-circumcision activist. And if you haven't watched it, I would recommend going and seeing his Sex and Circumcision, an American Love Story video. I'll leave a link in the description here for that, which is profound hatred of Judaism from this Jewish young man who is, I believe, now an attorney at law. He's come a little ways in the last 7 or 8 years. And I'll mention some honorable mentions. I'll throw in Milo Yiannopoulos and Costin Alamariu, or Bronze Age pervert. They're not explicit anti-Jews, I don't think, but they have that. You can recognize, once you've been around anti-Semitism for a while, you can, as I have, by the way, you can begin to recognize it. You can see it. Milo and Costin both have it a little bit. And finally, I will mention David Ballant, the character from the movie I mentioned earlier, The Believer. Now, Ryan Gosling is not Jewish, and his character, Daniel Ballant, is fictional. However, the movie is written by a man named Henry Bean, who is Jewish. Now, the movie is not anti-Jewish, but it depicts anti-Jewish sentiment with a seriousness in the words it gives to the anti-Jewish sentiment that the writer is familiar with these things and maybe has experienced it a little bit himself. What we see in Jewish anti-Jewishness, Jewish anti-Semitism, is a rebellion against oppressive religious force that they feel locked in by. They feel like this oppressive identity, this social, genetic, religious identity that is trapping them into a world that is an existence that is both confusing and causes the rest of the world to resent and hate them, and which causes them to feel inferior, but also superior, which only amplifies the feeling of inferiority, because then you feel like if you inherit a superiority complex that you don't feel like you've earned, you're going to feel like an imposter or a fraud, right? So the whole setup of Judaism sets up actual individual Jews for a very bad time. Is it any wonder that they are rebelling against this? Is it any wonder that they find refuge in Marxism, which is the great anti-identity movement? It's a religion of anti-identity. Man is not free until he revolves around himself as his own son, says Karl Marx. That is the goal of Marxism. And all the identity politics we see today, and I've talked about this in other office hours, you can check those out later. All the identity politics that we see today are just a means to an end of a degree of absolute individualism that even libertarians have a hard time like properly understanding. Anyone who accuses Marxism of being like collectivist, yes but no. It employs collectivism, but at its heart, collectivism is a complete misreading of what Marxism is about. So that's a lot about Jews and about Marxism and about identity and the frustration that Jews might be experiencing in this religion that they have been born into, the Geworfenheit, have been thrown into and might be rebelling against at times. And we find feminism as this rebellious expression against tradition, not in Orthodox Judaism or Jewishness proper, except in the Jews who were once Orthodox and then left it, but specifically in its secular rebels, the people who are not religiously Jewish, but something else. And moreover, those Jews were often influenced by non-Jews, specifically English women and men, in the case of our good utilitarian John Stuart Mill. So then what is the actual cause of feminism? If it's not Judaism, if it's not Jewishness per se, what do I think is the actual cause? I'm going to go from barely not pissing off some people to very strongly pissing off a few others. I think it is Christianity. Not by intention. I don't think Christianity set out to do this, and there are passages in the Bible that might sound rather unfeminist. Paul saying he will not suffer to hear a woman preach and so forth. There are all kinds of things like that in there, but there is, at a deeper level, and we find this especially in the strains of Protestantism and especially Puritanism, from which we get what's the badge, or the Unitarian Church, and we see this in the Episcopal. Am I saying that right? Episcopal Church. Pretty bad too, but the Unitarian one is by far the worst, which are the direct theological bloodline descendants of the Puritans, theologically speaking, who are pursuing theology from Scripture, divorced from the tradition that insulates and protects Catholics and Orthodox from what appears to be the doctrines of Scripture itself. And this is not just a bad reading of Galatians 3:8. There are no freemen and slaves, women and men, but all are one in Christ, or anything. It's a very abused line. But even at a much deeper level, at the heart of the text, there is a equality that arises from the duality, or the dual equalities of the possession of the divine image, the Imago Dei, which all men and women have alike, and in our inheritance of original sin. We are all sinners, and no one is. It's like the wages of sin is death. Sin is binary. It's a state of separation. It's not like, oh, he sinned more, so he's worse than you. But you sinned one time, but he sinned 5 times, so he... No. Sin is separation. Either you are apart from God, or you are free from sin in a state of connection with God. Many Christians misunderstand sin and conflate sin with immorality. That is a shallow theological take. Sin is not immorality. Immorality can lead to sin, or it can be sin in some cases. But it's not what it's about. And the separation from God on the one hand, and the sharing of the divine, of the likeness of God on the other, creates a spiritual bedrock of equality between all people that undergirds the idea of equality by means of this idea of dignity, which we have deeply imbibed into our culture, and which flowed through secular liberalism in the 18th and 19th and 20th century, even apart from its Christian roots. And there's some weird theological reasons how that was able to happen at all, which goes back to Feuerbach, who influenced Marx in interesting ways. And this is why, if you go back to the real roots of feminism, which go way earlier than the early 20th century, the roots of feminism are identical with the roots of abolitionism. It's in this spirit of equality that comes out of Christianity, specifically Puritan Christianity and Protestantism in general, which you do not see in Judaism. At that time, the Jews of that era were still as patriarchal in the feminist sense as anyone else, if not slightly more so, and were very deeply involved in the slave trade too. This is not coming from Judaism. So, then this leads to the question, well, then why are there so many Jews that are into and leading feminism? Well, I already mentioned the intensity of hatred for their own oppressive religion that we see there. But there's also a deep Jewish cultural influence in intellectual activities. And there might be some genetics involved in here too. I think there is a myth of just absurdly high Jewish IQ. They are not average 126 guys. That's a myth. But they are up there. They're in the high 90s, maybe 100 area, and it skews higher verbal when we look at the IQ breakdown between verbal and spatial. So it's not mysterious that we see lots of Jews in law or things like that. And we see this cultural interest in intellectual activities outside of just Marxism and socialism and feminism. I put together a short list here. But I left Spinoza out. Spinoza should be the start of our list. But the short list I included is Ayn Rand, the libertarian philosopher and novelist, Murray Rothbard and Milton Friedman, some of the most important libertarian thinkers of the last century. Leo Strauss and Alan Bloom, very important classicists, the novelists Saul Bellow and Philip Roth and Harold Bloom. And I want to throw in also, just because I remember seeing some videos of his with TJ Kirk back in the early days of YouTube, Howard Bloom. It's a very interesting, strange character and a prominent anti-feminist and Marxist, if memory serves. But this list would not be complete. You might know Ayn Rand as an anti-communist and an anti-feminist, but the serious one is Eric Voegelin. If you don't know the name of Eric Voegelin, you should. He is everything good that James Lindsay did before he went insane, against Marxism, came from Eric Voegelin. Now, Voegelin is interesting because he is also not a religious Jew. He was Catholic, but he's ethnically Jewish, right? So he should be pushing this this feminist nature that's in the nature of the Jew, right? If Marxism is truly, and it probably won't be, but if it is truly and utterly put down intellectually and ideologically in the next 40 or 50 years, no one will deserve more credit than Eric Voegelin. Not Ayn Rand, not any other anti-Marxist you can think of. It will be Eric Voegelin. Because of the arguments that he made about Marx and Marxism specifically, and what Marxism is, which is a religion. It is a theology. And James Lindsay makes those arguments better than I could, but you may as well go to the source, because I would not recommend James Lindsay to anyone anymore. So, and again, these are examples of Jews who have been very prominent in, and we can go back to Costin Alamariu, who is very much not a Marxist and certainly not a feminist. And of course, one of my favorites, Curtis Yarvin, who I do recommend to people. I would strongly recommend Curtis Yarvin for political theory. And again, neither a Marxist nor a feminist. So I think the genealogy of feminism presented by the video here, as it's coming from Judaism, is factually anthropologically, religiously, and historically false. It is maybe a little bit understandable why someone might come to that view when you look at the list of influential feminist thinkers who were Jews and be like, that's a whole lot of them. Wow, there's a lot of Jews in this list of Marxists here. Yeah, that's a real fact. Does that mean that these things are expressions of Jewishness, or is it more likely that they are reactions by individual Jews against a Jewishness that they came to hate and dislike in Jewish orthodoxy? I'll let you be the judge on that. I've said my piece, but I will conclude by making good on the promise of returning to a subject I said was very important earlier, which is taking these arguments seriously. And I mean the arguments from people that would have once been dismissed by the public as, oh, that's like white nationalist, or oh, that's like Nazi, or whatever. Oh, that's sexist. We are approaching a period now that my friend Jack Donovan has called the free speech fire hose, where a large percentage of the public, including some of the so-called intellectuals and so forth, have been protected by a bubble of not just censorship, but a bubble of taste. This is, oh, that view is so low class. That view is, oh, that smells like Nazi sympathizers. That smells like something we wouldn't deign to entertain or be seen in the same room with. Well, those people have been developing their arguments for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, maybe longer. They've been developing them with the aid of the internet and connection with each other into fairly viral strains that nobody has an inoculation against. And so now that we have a degree of free speech on X and we have more censorship, really, really broke when Obama left office. The shadow banning was in place for a while, but it just has not been able to stop the sheer volume of human interaction, the ability of these ideas to get around. You can't hide behind censorship and taste rejection anymore. Say, oh, that's so low class. Because all the taste makers who were saying this or that is, no serious intellectual entertains this, got egg all over their faces during COVID and other cases like that. COVID was the big one, though. So now everything's up in the air, and these arguments that were kept in the dark for many years are coming out with full viral force, and no one is armed to deal with them. You will not, if you want to beat these arguments, if you want to argue against white supremacy or Nazism or whatever idea it is you think is terrible and horrible, that has to begin. That has to be the defeat of those ideas has to begin by taking it seriously. If you ask a white supremacist or a fascist, and when I say fascist, I mean someone who describes themselves as a fascist, you will meet one if you go looking. And if you ask them, what led you to this position? What led you to believe the things you believe? What led you to believe that Jews are running the world and are evil and hate everybody? 8 to 9 out of 10 of them will say it was because everyone who I hated and who hated me kept defending the Jews, and there's a reversal of ideals, like these people who wanted me to be locked up for 2 years for COVID also think the worst people in the world are Nazis. These people who say I should lose my job to a foreigner because I'm a deplorable or whatever, they also go and you put on a yarmulke and kiss the wall in Israel or whatever. You can't just hide from these arguments because that only reinforces their strength. And if you haven't met these people, many of the people that would have been described as Nazis 5 years ago, first of all, many of them are way smarter than you and smarter than me. And secondly, they don't care anymore that you call them a Nazi or that you call them a white supremacist or whatever. They're beyond that. And no one else cares either. You can't bandwagon them anymore the way that you used to. So you have to take the argument seriously. You have to put on your big boy panties and learn how to entertain the arguments seriously and honestly. And by the way, they have created some good arguments. This one here that we're looking at, that feminism comes from Jewishness, is not one of their good arguments. This is a bad argument. But they have some tough ones. And if you want to fight against that, it's time to begin to take it seriously and to not to be squeamish, not to be intellectually squeamish about difficult subjects like this that pertain to race and religion and politics. You have to approach these questions like a philosopher, with the openness of Adeimantus and Glaucon, who say, I want to believe in justice, but because I want to believe in it, I want to present the strongest argument I can for injustice and see what we do with that. That's the only way that you'll successfully defend the things that you care about and find the best position at the end of the day. So anyways, that's what I think about feminism and the genealogy of feminism, which is really the proposed genealogy of Jewish influence on sex in the United States, which I don't think holds up. I don't think the video makes a correct claim, but I do think it's very important to look into that, and I do think there's a lot to say about Judaism that we have been prevented from saying for a very long time, and it's time to explore that. It's time to talk about it openly. So thank you for listening, and take care.